Ready to go? Fantastic. Thanks, guys. Okay. So, what we've got is a coloured skull here where we can see each individual bone quite clearly. So firstly, the cranial bones. So we've got frontal here. Note that it makes up quite a large part of the orbit. Then we have parietal behind that, so two, left and right. Temporal down here on the lateral side, and just in front of that, sphenoid. Remembering, of course, that we can see the sphenoid bone here in the orbit, and then also from an inferior point of view, running right across the middle of the skull there. And then, of course, this is a good point of view, the inferior point of view here, to look at the occipital bone as well, where we can see it completely surrounding the foramen magnum. So it really is quite large, but again, seen from a posterior point of view. Then we have lastly the ethmoid bone. Now we can see that from again from a couple of different points of view. Firstly, in the nasal cavity, here we've got the ethmoid bone in the center. And unfortunately, whoever's decided on the colour scheme here has made this bone here the same colour as the ethmoid, but it is in fact a separate bone. That's the inferior nasal concha, which we'll look at again later, but it is a separate bone. It's not part of the ethmoid, even though it's the same colour on the model. So there's ethmoid. We can also see it on the medial surface of the orbit here. So there's the ethmoid bone there. Now, if we were to remove the frontal bone, we'd also be able to see the ethmoid bone in the midline inside the cranial vault, but we'll look at that from a different point of view later on. So that's the cranial bones. Then if we look at the facial bones, we can see from an anterior point of view, we have the maxilla here, and then lateral to that, the zygomatic bone here in yellow. Of course, we have a mandible down here in white. And then nasal bones, same colour here, right at the front, middle. And notice that in the medial side of the orbit here, it goes nasal, maxilla, lacrimal in orange, and then ethmoid. So that's the order we've got here: nasal, maxilla, lacrimal, ethmoid. And then we have the palatine bone, which we can see here from an inferior point of view. You can see that most of the hard palate here is maxilla, but this orange part here, the posterior part of the palate, is actually the palatine bone. So it's only a small part of the hard palate. From here we can also see the vomer. So from this posterior and inferior point of view, we can see the vomer here making up the entire nasal septum from the posterior point of view. So it's very tall here. But if we have a look from an anterior point of view of the nasal septum, we can see that the vomer is really quite short here at the front. It's very pointed. So the vomer is very small here on the anterior point of view, and you can see that it's getting taller, it's getting bigger as we move posteriorly. So it's triangular, very pointed here, but much taller as we move posteriorly. Now the other part of the nasal septum is made up by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, which is this part here right in the center of the ethmoid bone there. Now if we have a quick look at a real skull, just to check those structures, because they're not that clear on the coloured plastic skull, here we can see a nasal septum, and it's a little bit deviated, but that's fairly usual. If we just turn sideways a little bit here from a slightly lateral point of view now, we can see the vomer is this little bit here. And this part here is the ethmoid, the part that's made up of the ethmoid. And we can actually see, or at least maybe it's my imagination, but I think I can see a line in there that it shows the separation of the two. So the vomer is the inferior part here, and the ethmoid the more superior part, anteriorly. But if we were looking posteriorly, as we were before, the entire septum here, this whole thing we can see here, is just vomer. So the vomer gets taller as it moves posteriorly. The ethmoid, the perpendicular plate, does the opposite. Okay, it's taller at the front and very short posteriorly, so we can't see it here. Then we can see the inferior nasal concha. So we'll stick with this bone just for this skull just for a sec. We've got a middle nasal concha here that's part of the ethmoid, and an inferior one here that's a separate bone. So again, if we look at the coloured skull, that's the one where they're both yellow, which is a bit of a shame. So this is the ethmoid here, yellow. This is the inferior nasal concha, which is also yellow, but it is a separate bone. The fact that they're yellow, both yellow, doesn't mean they're part of the same bone.